And now we come to the book of Leviticus. Leviticus is one of the strangest books of the Bible. What is it about? It's about holiness. And it's about, especially for us, it's a rather strange. It is about how God laid out the rules so that the Israelites could be holy and therefore they could worship and come into his presence.
The Old Testament isn't intended for anybody other than Israel. He fulfilled the Levitical law already. He is our sacrifice.
Much said about God's mercy, much said about his grace. There is a great emphasis on the fact that God forgives, that he empowers. Almost nothing is said about the law of God, about the judgment of God, about the heinousness of violating his law and the just consequences of such a violation. And so, in a sense, the gospel, which means the good news, is stripped of what is really good because people don't know what is really bad, which makes the good news such good news.
Welcome to Diggin Deeper, a simple Bible study where we dig deeper into the Word of God. Thank you for joining me. I am your host, Billy Ray Parrish. For today's study, we continue in the book of Leviticus. This is the third book of the Torah and the Old Testament to provide instruction and laws to guide a sinful people. However, as we have witnessed through the first two books of the Bible, God redeemed humanity time and time again. And the same is still true today, but it requires a relationship with a holy God. Leviticus Chapter 11 is made up of 47 verses beginning with verse 1. And the Lord spake unto Moses and to Aaron, saying unto them, Speak unto the children of Israel, saying, These are the beasts which ye shall eat among all the beasts that are on the earth. Whatsoever partake the hoof, and is cloven-footed, and cheweth the cud, among the beasts, that shall ye eat. Nevertheless these shall ye not eat of them that chew the cud, or of them that divide the hoof, as the camel, because he cheweth the cud, but divideth not the hoof, he is unclean unto you. And the coney, because he cheweth the cud, but divideth not the hoof, he is unclean unto you. And the hare, because he cheweth the cud, but divideth not the hoof, he is unclean unto you. And the swine, though he divide the hoof, and be cloven-footed, yet he cheweth not the cud, he is unclean to you. Of their flesh shall ye not eat, and their carcass shall ye not touch, they are unclean to you. These shall ye eat of all that are in the waters, whatsoever hath fins, and scales in the waters, in the seas, and in the rivers, them shall ye eat. And all that have not fins and scales in the seas, and in the rivers, of all that move in the waters, and of any living thing which is in the waters, they shall be an abomination unto you. They shall be even an abomination unto you, ye shall not eat of their flesh, but ye shall have their carcasses in abomination. Whatsoever hath no fins nor scales in the waters, that shall be an abomination unto you. And these are they which ye shall have an abomination among the fowls, they shall not be eaten. They are an abomination, the eagle, and the ossifrage, and the osprey, and the vulture, and the kite after his kind, every raven after his kind, and the owl, and the night hawk, and the cuckow, and the hawk after his kind, and the little owl, and the cormorant, and the great owl, and the swan, and the pelican, and the gier eagle, and the stork, the heron after her kind, and the lapwing, and the bat. All fowls that creep, going upon all four, shall be an abomination unto you. Yet these may ye eat of every flying creeping thing that goeth upon all four, which have legs above their feet, to leap withal upon the earth, even these of them ye may eat, the locust after his kind, and the bald locust after his kind, and the beetle after his kind, and the grasshopper after his kind. But all other flying creeping things, which have 4 feet, shall be an abomination unto you. And for these ye shall be unclean. Whosoever toucheth the carcass of them shall be unclean until the even. And whosoever beareth aught of the carcass of them shall wash his clothes, and be unclean until the even. The carcasses of every beast which divideth the hoof, and is not cloven food, nor cheweth the cud, are unclean unto you. Every one that toucheth them shall be unclean. And whatsoever goeth upon his paws, among all manner of beasts that go on all 4, those are unclean unto you. Whoso toucheth their carcass shall be unclean until the even. And he that beareth the carcass of them shall wash his clothes, and be unclean until the even. They are unclean unto you. These also shall be unclean unto you among the creeping things that creep upon the earth, the weasel, and the mouse, and the tortoise after his kind, and the ferret, and the chameleon, and the lizard, and the snail, and the mole. These are unclean to you among all that creep. Whosoever doth touch them, when they be dead, shall be unclean until the even. And upon whatsoever any of them, when they are dead, doth fall, it shall be unclean, whether it be any vessel of wood, or raiment, or skin, or sack, whatsoever vessel it be, wherein any work is done, it must be put into water. And it shall be unclean until the even, so it shall be cleansed. And every earthen vessel, whereinto any of them falleth, whatsoever is in it shall be unclean, and ye shall break it. Of all meat which may be eaten, that on which such water cometh shall be unclean. And all drink that may be drunk in every such vessel shall be unclean. And everything whereupon any part of their carcass falleth shall be unclean, whether it be oven, or ranges for pots, they shall be broken down, for they are unclean, and shall be unclean unto you. Nevertheless a fountain or pit, wherein there is plenty of water, shall be clean. But that which toucheth their carcass shall be unclean. And if any part of their carcass fall upon any sowing seed which is to be sown, it shall be clean. But if any water be put upon the seed, and any part of their carcass fall thereon, it shall be unclean unto you. And if any beast, of which ye may eat, die, he that toucheth the carcass thereof shall be unclean until the even. And he that eateth of the carcass of it shall wash his clothes, and be unclean until the even. He also that beareth the carcass of it shall wash his clothes, and be unclean until the even. And every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth shall be an abomination, it shall not be eaten. Whatsoever goeth upon the belly, and whatsoever goeth upon all 4, or whatsoever hath more feet among all creeping things that creep upon the earth, them ye shall not eat, for they are an abomination. Ye shall not make yourselves abominable with any creeping thing that creepeth. Neither shall ye make yourselves unclean with them, that ye should be defiled thereby. For I am the Lord your God. Ye shall therefore sanctify yourselves. And ye shall be holy, for I am holy. Neither shall ye defile yourselves with any manner of creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth. For I am the Lord that bringeth you up out of the land of Egypt, to be your God. Ye shall therefore be holy, for I am holy. This is the law of the beasts, and of the fowl, and of every living creature that moveth in the waters, and of every creature that creepeth upon the earth, to make a difference between the unclean and the clean, and between the beast that may be eaten and the beast that may not be eaten. Chapter 11 opens by indicating that God spoke to Moses and Aaron about clean and unclean foods. This section of the book establishes which animals are lawful to eat and which are not. Leviticus chapter 11 verse 1 is part of a section of the book of Leviticus that deals with how to be holy, as God is holy. Verse 2, God instructs the Israelites to eat certain animals and avoid others. This was a ceremonial law that distinguished between clean and unclean animals. Verse 3 explains that a hoof that is split into 2 toes, like those of cattle, deer, pigs, and sheep, chews the cud, and chewing the cud ruminates, or brings up partially digested food from its stomach to chew again. Verse 4 states that camels are unclean because they chew the cud, but do not have split hooves. Verse 5 states that the coney is unclean because it chews the cud, but does not divide the hoof. In case you are wondering, a coney is a small, rabbit-like animal called a hyrax in modern terms, specifically the Syrian hyrax. Verse 6 explains the reason the animal was considered unclean was due to its chewing habits, despite not having a divided hoof essentially. It's a creature that appears to be like a rabbit, but is not classified as such according to the dietary laws of the Torah. Verse 7 explains the pig as unclean despite having a split hoof. The pig does not chew its cud. Verse 8 describes a prohibition against eating the meat of certain animals and touching their carcasses, as these animals are considered unclean. The verse reinforces the broader theme of ritual purity and obedience to divine instructions. Verses 9 explain that fish with fins and scales are considered clean and permissible to eat, while those without fins and scales are considered unclean and should not be eaten, whereas verse 10 explains that any living thing in the seas and rivers that does not have fins and scales is considered detestable and should not be eaten. Verse 11 continues the previous 2 verses, 9 and 10, by explaining eating of the unclean is an abomination. An Israelite was not to eat or touch the carcass of such an animal. Verse 12 further repeats any creature living in water that lacks fins and scales is considered unclean and should not be eaten by the Israelites. Verse 13 begins listing birds that are considered unclean and therefore should not be eaten. The passage specifically mentions the eagle, the ossifrage, and the osprey as examples of birds that are unclean. Verse 13 explains the osprey is listed among the birds that are considered unclean and should be avoided for consumption. The osprey, also known as the sea hawk, is a bird of prey that primarily feeds on fish. Verse 15 lists any kind of raven as unclean according to the dietary laws. The raven, known in Hebrew as orav, is a bird often associated with desolation and uncleanliness in the Bible. Ravens are scavengers, feeding on carrion, which made them ritually unclean according to Levitical law. Verse 16 mentions the owl, the night hawk, and the cuckoo as unclean birds. The prohibition of these birds is one of many regulations aimed at distinguishing the Israelites from other peoples and emphasizing their unique relationship with God. Verse 17 further adds to the list of unclean birds that should not be eaten, including the little owl, cormorant, and great owl. Verse 18 describes the swan, the pelican, and the gier eagle as unclean birds. The pelican is described as a large and voracious bird that fills its capacious pouch with fish and uses it to feed its young. The gier eagle, also known as the carrion vulture, is a bird that feeds on carrion and is considered unclean. Verse 19 adds the stork, which is known for its kindness to both its dam and its young, and the bat, a creature that flies at night, and is described as being between a bird and a beast, partaking of both but belonging to neither category, to the list of unclean animals. Verse 20 labels all flying insects that walk on all fours as unclean, meaning they should not be eaten by the Israelites. Insects such as flies, beetles, and other similar creatures are categorized as unclean under this law. However, there are exceptions for certain types of locusts, katydids, crickets, and grasshoppers, which are allowed to be eaten. Verse 21 describes certain insects that are permissible to eat. Specifically, it refers to flying insects that have legs above their feet, enabling them to leap on the earth. These include locusts, katydids, crickets, and grasshoppers. Here, it is distinguished that these insects from others that walk on all fours and have 4 legs but do not have the specific characteristic of having legs above their feet to leap. Verse 22 describes certain types of locusts and insects that are permissible to eat. It lists the locust, the bald locust, the beetle, and the grasshopper, all of which are considered clean and acceptable for consumption. The locust is described as a type of insect known for its swarming behavior, and is often associated with the plagues in Egypt. The bald locust, beetle, and grasshopper are also specified as clean, with the bald locust possibly named for its rugged appearance and the beetle for its nimbleness. Verse 23 describes that all other winged insects with 4 feet are to be regarded as unclean and should not be eaten. According to verse 24, touching the carcasses of unclean animals makes a person ceremonially unclean until the evening, requiring purification through washing clothes, and waiting until evening to be considered clean again. Verse 25 describes that anyone who carries the skin of an animal that was considered unclean would become unclean until evening and must wash their clothes. Verse 26 explains anyone who touches the carcasses of certain animals that do not meet God's specifications of cleanness will become unclean until evening, and must wash their clothes, which emphasizes the spiritual significance of avoiding that which is associated with death and separation from God. Verse 27 explains that animals that walk on paws, such as dogs or bears, are considered unclean, and touching their carcasses makes a person ceremonially unclean until the evening. Verse 28 states that if any of the unclean animals mentioned in the previous verses touch any wooden object, article of clothing, or skin, or if one of these items is placed on a stone and then touched by an unclean animal, the item becomes unclean. This means that anyone who touches these objects must wash their clothes and remain unclean until evening. Verse 29 lists specific animals considered unclean for the Israelites. These include the weasel, mouse, and tortoise, among others. For example, weasels were considered unclean. And a reminder of the importance of purity, a mouse was unclean, symbolizing impurity and the need for spiritual discernment. And a tortoise was unclean, contributing to the broader theme of dietary laws and their spiritual significance. Verse 30 describes certain small and creeping animals as unclean for the Israelites. The verse lists the ferret, chameleon, lizard, snail, and mole as animals that should not be consumed or engaged with, as contact with their dead bodies would make a person unclean until evening. Verse 31 emphasizes the laws regarding creatures that move along the ground, declaring them unclean for the Israelites. This verse serves as a summary of the specific animals listed in the preceding verses, such as the gecko, monitor lizard, and chameleon. According to the verse, anyone who touches these dead animals is considered unclean until evening, highlighting the need for purity and separation from what is deemed unclean. Verse 32 states that anything an unclean animal falls on becomes unclean. This includes clothing, wood, leather, and sacks. The items must be washed with water and will remain unclean until evening. Verse 33 states that if one of certain unclean animals falls into an earthen vessel, everything in the vessel becomes unclean. The vessel should then be broken. Verse 34 states that food that touches unclean water becomes unclean. and any liquid from the same container also becomes unclean. In other words, any food or drink that comes into contact with unclean water from an unclear vessel is unclean itself, requiring it to be discarded or treated as unfit for consumption. Verse 35 states that anything that comes into contact with a part of an unclean animal's carcass becomes unclean itself. Specifically, it states that if an oven or cooking pot is contaminated, it must be broken down because it is unclean, and shall remain unclean to the Israelites. Verse 36 states that a spring or cistern that collects water is clean, even if the carcass of an unclean animal falls into it. However, the person who touches the carcass becomes unclean. This indicates that the water's purity is not affected by the presence of the carcass, but direct contact with the carcass renders a person ceremonially unclean until evening. Verse 37 states that if a part of a dead animal's carcass falls on seed for sowing, the seed remains clean. However, verse 38 states that if water has been put on seeds, and a carcass falls on them, the seeds become unclean. This verse highlights the importance of specific conditions in determining purity, as wet seeds can absorb impurities more easily than dry seeds, making them susceptible to defilement. According to verse 39, if a person touches the carcass of a clean animal that has died naturally, they become ceremonially unclean until evening and must wash their clothes. John Gill's exposition of the Bible explains any clean beast as the ox, sheep, goat, deer what, if rightly killed, is very lawful to eat of, but if it died of itself through any distemper, or was torn by the wild beasts, so the Targum of Jonathan, not the bones, nerves, horns, hoofs, or skin, as Jarchi observes, these might be handled, because some of them, at least, were wrought up into one instrument or another by artificers for use and service, but the flesh of them might not be touched. Whoever did touch it was ceremonially unclean, and might not go into the sanctuary, or have conversation with men, until the evening of the day in which this was done. Verse 40 speaks of clean and unclean animals, and the creeping things mentioned are those that crawl on the ground, such as insects, and are considered unclean and not to be consumed. The context of this verse is within the broader theme of holiness and separation from impurity. God instructs the Israelites to be holy as He is holy, emphasizing the importance of maintaining purity and sanctity in their lives. Verse 41 declares that every creature that moves along the ground is to be regarded as unclean and should not be eaten. This includes all small animals that scurry along the ground, those that slither on their bellies, and those with 4 legs or many feet. Verse 42 instructs the Israelites not to eat any creature that moves along the ground, whether it moves on its belly, walks on all 4s, or has many feet. These creatures are considered unclean, and eating them is prohibited. Verse 43 instructs followers not to defile themselves by coming into contact with certain creatures. This means avoiding both eating and touching these creatures to prevent becoming ceremonially unclean. Verse 44 emphasizes the importance of holiness and separation for the Israelites. It calls them to reflect God's holiness in their lives, both spiritually and physically. Verse 45 is a command that serves as a conclusion to the regulations of clean and unclean animals. Verse 46 explains the law concerning various living creatures, including beasts, birds, and creatures that move in the waters, as well as those that creep on the earth. Verse 47 contains instructions for distinguishing between clean and unclean animals, and between those that may be eaten and those that may not be eaten. The chapter ends with an emphasis of making these distinctions as part of religious and dietary laws. Chapter 11 teaches that God's intent was to make Israel a holy nation, separate from other nations. The laws regarding clean and unclean animals were part of the ceremonial law given to the Israelites, which aimed to teach them to distinguish themselves from other nations and to maintain a standard of holiness. The laws in Leviticus 11 are ritual categories, not moral categories. The laws in Leviticus 11 are very particular and strict. The laws in Leviticus 11 are intended to teach the people to distinguish between clean and unclean. The laws in Leviticus 11 are intended to show the people how to be holy as God is holy. Certain details about the animals. Clean animals were allowed to be eaten and come into God's presence, and unclean animals were not allowed to be eaten and could not come into God's presence. Clean animals had completely cloven hooves and chewed the cud. Unclean animals included pigs, camels, rock badgers, and rabbits. The distinction was symbolic, representing God's choice of Israel as a clean people, set apart from other nations. The distinction was also a way to teach the Israelites to be holy, set apart for God's purpose. The distinction was a way to preserve the Israelites' health and protect them from disease. The purpose of these laws was to instill a sense of holiness and purity among the Israelites, reflecting God's holiness and setting them apart from other nations. These regulations were not just about health and hygiene, but also had spiritual significance, teaching the Israelites to maintain a lifestyle that honored God. We have reached the end of our Bible study today for Leviticus chapter 11. I am excited to be in a new book of the Bible, and we have finished the first 11 chapters of Leviticus. I am thankful for each of you for continuing to tune into the program with me. We are beginning to put together an impressive list of programs. The first 2 books of the Bible have been really fun to learn and really deep, but there is so much more to come. There is no telling what the next studies will reveal, so join us next time for our Bible study here on Diggin Deeper, as we simply dig deeper into the Word of God. Before we go, if you liked what you just watched, like and share our content. It really helps us grow. And think about subscribing to our channel, which will help you keep up to date with all of our content. Once again, I am your host Billy Ray Parrish, and until next time, thank you for joining us. Stay safe and God bless.